Okay, good afternoon and welcome to StoneTalk. I'm your host, Jason Osgood. I'm the Senior Director of Distribution for StoneHardscapes. This is a monthly webinar series talking about everything about natural stone, from installation to product care. This is the third installment, and today we're going to be talking about the best practices for a successful coping installation. For those of you who are new and you missed the first two episodes on decking installation, both a basic and an advanced installation series, you can go back and watch those, as well as our designer webinar hosted by our senior design architect specialist, Linda Abbott, on our StoneHardscapes YouTube channel. So with that, let's get started. There are 6 steps to a successful coping installation. Your shell and your surface prep, the determination of your elevation, your layout, and your starting point, your mortar bed installation, the coping itself installation, the grouting, and the cleaning. Now, this webinar is going to focus on the basics. This is going to take a look at it from about a 20,000 foot level. To get really in depth, it's more of a hands-on training. It's more of a job site training, which we can also do. But this, keep in mind, this episode is really going to be basically on the basic sides of this. So, step 1, shell prep and surface prep. Several steps to this. Make sure you clean and remove any debris from the shell beam itself. You want to clean the skimmer opening. You want to clean all the areas that the coping is going to cover itself. You want to remove any high spots on the beam that are noticeable, high spots like overpour from the shell itself, any sort of nodules that are sticking up. You also want to determine at this point whether or not the coping fits on the beam itself. Determine if the coping needs a resting edge. You don't want your coping hanging more than 2 inches on the back side of the shell. So if you have a shell beam and it's 8 inches and you have a 16-inch piece of coping, then you're going to want to pour a resting beam around. If you have to pour a resting edge, then once that has cured, you want to go back and repeat steps 1 to 3. You want to clean and remove any debris, clean your skimmer opening again, and make sure that you've cleaned all the areas that the coping is going to touch. Remember, this is the start of your project. Just like when we talked about decking installation, the prep is the most important aspect of this. If you don't do your prep correctly, then you're not going to get proper adhesion. So remember, this is the start of your project. So if the shell is not properly cleaned and hydrated, you risk an inadequate adhesion of your coping. So you want to make sure you want to grind off all the high spots and rough areas. Use a grinder, use an angle grinder, just anything you can get to sort of clean that beam off and give the coping a nice edge to set on. Remove any sand and debris. Wet the coping down, spray it off with a hose, make sure it's clean. You're going to do 2 things here. You're going to clean your beam. You're also going to hydrate the shell itself. And the hydration aspect of this is very important. If you have a shell that is very dry, the shell itself will pull the moisture out of the mortar bed, and you're taking the chance that the mortar bed itself cracks or you don't get proper adhesion. So you always want to make sure that your shell is good and hydrated. The second step to this is determining your elevation and your layout. You want to use a leveling device to determine the levelness of the shell itself. Keep in mind how volatile the installation of a gunite or shotcrete shell is. Let's not forget about our fiberglass pools or the vinyl liner pools themselves. Very difficult to make that beam absolutely level. So you want to make sure at this point where your high spots are, where your low spots are. Again, If the coping hangs more than 2 inches off the back of the pool beam, then a resting collar needs to be formed and poured. You can do this on not only a gunite and a shotcrete shell, but you can also do this on fiberglass and a vinyl pool. And then if the shell is determined to be out of level, you need to find those spots that they're out of level, because the coping and the tile will show, once there's water in the pool, the coping and the tile will pinpoint drastically if the pool is out of level. Nothing else does this more than coping in your tile. So this has to be absolutely perfect. And when you set your coping, that determines your elevation for the deck. That determines the fall for the deck. That determines how level the deck is going to be as well. There's a couple of different things that you can use to determine the elevation of the pool beam. First, and the most common, is a water leveling tool. Just a 1/2 inch or a 3/4 inch piece of tubing filled with water, sometimes filled with food coloring so you can see the water better. And that's used to determine how level the beam is. Remember that connected water will always find a common level. So if you've got 2 bodies of water that are connected, they're not going to be out of level. There will be a common level unless there is something mechanical stopping that. The second way are either a sight or a laser level. They're very accurate, and they can be used over multiple types of applications, whether it's your tile, your coping, your excavation, or your deck material. The nice thing about these are these can be used over multiple applications. Now, on the left is an adjustable sight level. It's a 2-person process. The sight level stays in the pool with 1 person behind the scope, moving it as the tape man walks around the pool and sets elevation marks. Now, it's less expensive than a laser level. However, a laser level is practical because 1 person can do it. You set the level inside the pool or on the beam, and the laser sends beams out, and 1 person can walk all the way around the pool and be able to see where the beam is low and where the beam is high. Disadvantage to a self-leveling rotary laser level is that it is expensive. Now let's talk about the process of setting our elevations. So there's a couple different things. There's your elevation mark. This is the mark where you determine a spot to start on the beam, right? So you find a spot somewhere on the pool shell, measure down however you want to do it, whether it's 5.5 inches or 6 inches, depending on the width of the tile itself, and you determine that spot. You determine the depth of the beam depending on the tile and the coping installation. It's usually somewhere in the midpoint. Now, this mark does not move. This is your set elevation mark. The elevation point is the multiple points around the pool that help determine the levelness. On straight walls, you want to mark about every 6 to 8 feet. On curved walls, you want to mark every 2 to 3 feet. When using a water level, the point man, and we'll see it in the picture next, is the man who calls out and determines the elevation. Once these marks on the shell are made, you want to use a straight edge or a chalk line, or you can use masonite to connect these elevation marks around the pool. Now, what that's going to do is that's going to give you a precise level that you can build your beam onto. So if you're a couple inches under the shell and you set your elevation line and you chalk it, and in the far left side of the pool, it's 3 inches below, on the far right side of the pool, it's 3.5 inches below, you know that your shell is a 1/2 inch out of elevation. So let's take a look at some pictures. So in this picture, and we will reference this picture multiple times, but in this picture, you see a nice rectangle pool. You see the elevation mark with the point man who started back on the back left-hand corner of this pool, has the water line, and as that water line stabilizes in that hose and hits that mark, he yells out mark. The mark man will mark on his side of the pool when he hears those words from the point man. And he just moves around the pool. And as he moves around the pool on this straight edge, he'll do it every 6 to 8 feet. And that gives him a clear elevation for his beam. Once they're done, they chalk this, and they use a chalk line to mark this level. And what they've done on this particular pool is they've gone 5.5 inches below the beam because they determined that the shell was a little bit out of level. And so with that, they went 5.5 inches below the beam. They got a exact level, and now they can build from there. Using a self-leveling laser, this gentleman found one static point. That laser sent beams out across that entire backyard, and he just walks around the edge of that pool with his laser detector, and that laser detector tells him the different elevations, and he marks it on the shell itself. So if he's at 2 inches in one spot and he's at 2.5 inches in another spot, he knows that that 2.5 inches, he's 1/2 inch low. So he marks it on the shell, and that gives him, again, another way to determine the levelness of his beam. The third way is the sight level. Now, as you can see, the sight man is in the middle of the pool looking through the scope, and the mark man has a tape measure, and he's measuring down where he needs to be. And they determine from there, if in one spot he sees 5 inches, and in one spot he sees 4 inches, he knows that the beam's an inch out of level. We'll go back to our rectangle pool. Now they have this done and they've marked their level. What they're going to install from the level down, level up, is bender board, or in this case, Homosote. And they're 5.5 inches down. That's a 6-inch piece of Homosote. That means that the finished top of this Homosote, this bender board, is a 1/2 inch above the beam at its highest point. And as you can see in this picture, how the shell kind of wobbles up and down along this left edge. What this is determining that the top of that bender board is spot on level. In this picture, you see they did the same thing, but here they used masonite. They determined that the shell was a little bit out of level. They put the masonite at level they needed, and they're going to pour some concrete in there, some mortar bed in there to level this beam off perfectly. Now, step 3, your mortar bed installation. Again, hydrate the beam itself. Make sure the beam is wet. You do not want to, again, you don't want to install the mortar over a dry bed, because if you do, the bed itself, especially in some of these hot states, the shell itself will just wick that moisture right out, and it will not give that mortar time to cure, and it will crack and your coping stone will come off. So hydrate your beam as you go. Do about 6 to 8 feet at a time. You want to mix a bag of modified pre-blended mortar with water to a damp consistency that allows you to clump the mud in your fist or a 2-inch slump. Too watery, your coping won't stand, won't stay level. Too dry, and it won't cure right, and it'll crack. So you want to be able to take your mortar and clump it up in your fist into a ball. Yeah, obviously dump the mud onto the beam using a bucket or a shovel, and you want to spread the material to your desired height to the top of the bender board. Now, keep this in mind. If you're using your mortar bed to stick your coping down onto immediately, then you're going to want to use a notch trowel. So you run your notch trowel onto the top of the bender board, and then you can stick your coping stones right down on that. If your shell is more than 1 inch out of level, and you have to pour the mortar bed first to level your beam up, then you're going to want to pour it in there and use a wood float to achieve a nice, smooth, level finish. Any more than 1 inch on trying to install the coping stone, you take the chance that the mortar itself isn't going to adhere properly. Again, remembering to obviously hydrate your shell and work in about 6 to 8 feet at a time. Here's a good picture of these gentlemen installing some coping using the mortar bed itself as the adhesion. And then we'll go back to this rectangle pool again, and you can see they're doing the same thing. They determined again on this pool that it wasn't too far out of level, so they were able to use the mortar bed as their adhesion. So as they pour it in there, they level it off, they use their notch trials, they'll add some to the back of the coping as well and mud it down. Now on geometric shaped pools, I strongly advise as you're laying these out, as you can see in this picture, use guidelines. Use string lines along the front side of the coping itself, and it gives you a guide to run the coping right up to, push the coping up to, and it makes it for a much easier and quicker installation because you've got something that already there determining how far you want the coping to lay over, to push the coping up to. Simple process, everybody has string, everybody has stakes. Use your string lines as you're installing your coping. Now let's talk about step 4, the coping installation itself. As we talked in the previous 2 episodes about your deck installation, the first thing you want to do when it comes to installing your decking material or your coping material is you want to determine where to start. And I have always suggested you want to start the installation at your focal point, because what you don't want to happen is the focal spot to have cut material, to have misshapen sizes or misshapen pieces because you didn't determine a good area. Hide your cuts. Every pool is going to have some odd cuts. Every coping install is going to have some odd cuts, and you want to hide those as best as possible. So the first thing to do is determine the focal point. Is it out of the kitchen looking at the pool? Is it out of the family room looking at the pool? Find out where your most visible aspect of the pool is and make sure that you're not putting cuts there. On geometric shape, install your guidelines and measure the wall lengths to make sure that your cuts are similarly on similarly sized walls. So if you've got 8-foot walls on this pool, you want to make sure you match your cuts on all those 8-foot walls. You don't want things to look odd because you didn't measure. Measure the lengths and match your cuts and be repetitive. Again, if you've got similarly length walls on geometric shaped pools, make sure your coping looks exactly the same on all those walls. If it doesn't, over time, it will stand out. And the last thing we want to happen is for that homeowner to notice it, and then that's all that they'll notice. Why do I have a small cut here when I don't have a small cut there? On freeform pools, if at all possible, start on a straight wall. Get the process started. Work your way back to the beginning, but more importantly than anything is try to hide your cuts. Hide your cuts next to a transition, hide your cuts next to a step, hide your cuts next to the coping, or the skimmer if that's possible. Hide your cuts on a back interior in a corner somewhere, but do the best you can to hide your cuts. Once you've installed your mortar bed, and once you've got your grout on the backside of your mortar on the backside of your coping, you put your coping in, you want to firmly press it, wiggle it a little bit, make sure that you've got complete coverage from side to side and front to back. Take a torpedo level to ensure that you're level from front to back and side to side, and then have a 4-foot level with you so that you make sure that you're level to the adjacent stones on a long run, a 4-foot run. Because I promise you, if you're only leveling each piece out, eventually you're going to get a little bit out of whack. And once you get a little bit out of whack, you're going to end up being a lot out. So carry those levels with you, make sure each piece is level, and then make sure each piece is level to the one next to it. So I've got an illustration here to kind of help us with this. First thing you want to do, when you install your guidelines is to determine the amount of overhang, determine your cantilever. If you are putting the coping on prior to the tile, make sure that you add for the thickness of the tile and the tile's mortar bed when you put your coping on. So if you determine that you need a 2-inch overhang, so you determine that, put your guidelines on of that 2-inch overhang. Measure the wall length to determine the coping spacing, right? So if we've got a certain wall length and we determine that we can get 15 pieces in there, it's a much easier install than to try to do it and then try to figure out towards the end of that wall on what I need to do. Also, determine where you can start and if you need cuts. And install the coping on a straight wall first. It's same with the decking material. You always want to install the decking material on straight edges. It's a much easier process than starting the coping on straight walls first. You get the process started, kind of gives you a better rhythm, and it gives you an idea of where you're going to be when you start getting into those radius cuts. Now, why do we pre-measure? I get this question all the time as why do I need to pre-measure? And there's a lot of guys in our industry that don't. They've been doing it long enough where they can figure it out. And a lot of guys who've been doing it a long time still do it. But I've got two different scenarios here. On the top of this pool, we didn't pre-measure and we just started on the right-hand side with a full piece and we worked our way all the way down and ended up with a cut piece. Now, over time, that uneven piece of coping is going to stand out. You're gonna see it, the homeowner's gonna see it, and that's all they're gonna be able to focus on. So is that a better way to do it? Or on the bottom side here, we determined the center point of this wall. We worked our way both sides and we determined that it was easier here to put two smaller cuts in the corners. They're hidden, they're next to the corners themselves. So now I've got a symmetrical wall. And if I've done this properly, the wall that's above this, where the one piece is, should look exactly the same as the wall that's below it with the two cut pieces. Now that gives me symmetry. And where our industry is going right now, where we see it for the foreseeable future, is geometric in shape, long, linear, symmetry. And I promise you, if you install a job with one cut piece on a wall where we could have had two, that one piece will stand out. The other cutting question I get all the time is how to cut a radius. Now, unless you're getting custom cuts, which can be done on most stones, unless you're getting custom cuts, you're going to have to cut a rectangle piece of coping or a square piece of coping to fit a radius at some point. So the way to do that is, again, determine your overhang or your cantilever. You want to place the coping stones on the inside edge, touching the adjacent stone. As you can see in this illustration, they're touching the front face of this corner to corner. You want to measure the distance on the outside edge, in this case, and divide it by 2. In this case, let's say it's 2-inch gap. Then you're going to need to cut 1 inch off of each piece. So what you'll see is you'll cut it from front to back because we want if this is an inside radius, so on this inside radius, you cut the front side of the coping to the back side of the coping. You go from the coping stone on the left with the dotted lines to the coping stone on the right. Now, when you do that, this becomes this, and it gives you a much better and cleaner look on the install. And that's what we're going for. We're going for a clean install. We're going for something that looks custom, that looks like it fits. And if you try to and continue to do things, install radius cuts like you see on the left here, it will stand out over time. You'll have an installer come in and say, I can do it and I can cut you radius cuts. And it's just a better finished look. Now, steps 5 and 6. If you have a coping that has a grout joint greater than 1/8 of an inch, you want to mix sanded grout to a dam consistency that allows you to clump the mud in your fist, just like we do with a mortar bed. For grout joints less than 1/8 of an inch, You'll have to use a non-sanded grout. Push the grout in between each stone with your hand. You can use a damp sponge or a grout bag or a grout float to do this. And when grouting the nose of the stone, you're going to need to use your hand. Remember, we've got a cantilever. We got to get that grout in between the pieces themselves. So use your hand, feather it in there, pack it in as best as you can. Wipe the excess off as you go. I promise you, if you try to wipe the excess off later, it's going to be a much harder process. So do wipe it off as you go. And remember, it's going to haze. It's going to dry up. You're going to need to do this process multiple times. So before the grout completely dries, use a wet sponge to remove any remaining grout left on the stones. This process may be repeated several times, and it's going to be repeated several times. Now, once the grout completely dries, you can use a very, very weak, less than 10% mixture of muriatic acid and water to remove any of the lingering haze. Grout will put a lingering haze on there, but if you go any higher than 10%, you're running the risk of hurting the stone itself. So it's got to be less than 10%. But I'm going to say this, water and repetitiveness work the best. So use the water that you have, use the sponge that you have. You can use a 3M scrub pad to scrub it off, but water and repetitiveness work best. And what you'll get is a nice, clean, finished job. Now, obviously, we're not looking at the pool here, but the coping is a beautiful install on this coping. And then as we go back to our rectangle pool, these gentlemen are now finished. That beam is perfectly level. The shell was not, but the beam was perfectly level. Remember, water will find a level. So if your pool's out of whack, if your pool's out of level, the water will be level and it'll show. You'll have the water 3 inches below the beam in one spot and 2 inches below the beam on another spot, and it'll show that your pool is not level itself. So with this install, you see here, this is perfectly level. Now that water level is going to be perfect on that waterline tile, and we won't have any issues. Here's a beautiful one with silver travertine. Beautiful install. Nice radius cuts on this 12 by 12, both inside and outside. And with that, this episode is finished. Do we have any questions? Okay. I thank everybody for joining us today. Please join me next month when we have another episode in our webinar series. And please join Linda Abbott next Wednesday for her designer series. With that, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.